Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good day and welcome to the show here on the Delta Report. Thank you for tuning in. I'm glad to have you guys here. Today is Monday, and it's Monday the 5th of September, 2022. And here's what I want to talk about is, you guys have heard me talk about in my shows how we are going to have a society that, well, there was a show years ago that was done called The Time Machine. And basically what it was about, this guy went way off into the future. And he saw these two different types of a separation between mankind, between two different groups in the future. One was the Eloi, where a kind, gentle people lived on the surface of the earth. And then there was the Molochs that lived down beneath the ground. And the Molochs utilized the Eloi for their own benefit. They would come up out of the ground and act like monsters and take the Eloi down below the ground at certain times, like they were harvesting them. The Elois, the Molochs. And the Molochs were turned into an ugly, grotesque-looking being that lived underneath the ground, and the Elois were still beautiful-looking people that lived on the surface in this science fiction film. Well, you know, something similar is going to happen. Really going to happen. But not that there's going to be Molochs living under the ground or anything like that. Let me explain. I've talked about it on my shows a number of times. We are in a decay and fall of basically the world empire. This has happened before. There was a decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Several times through history. The decline and fall of the Mongolian Empire. Decline and fall of the it's on the tip of my tongue, the Medes and Persians, their empire that they built. It's happened numbers of times through history that the world has expanded to a certain point where it cannot support itself properly, and you get a decline and fall of an empire. And this empire that's built today is the Anglo-American dual world empire. And why it's a dual world empire is it was ruled by Britain, Great Britain, who was said about Great Britain at a certain point in history that the sun never set on the British Empire. Places like Canada here and Australia were under the British Empire. Well, the British Empire somewhat joined together with the American Empire to create a dual world empire that has existed for all the time I've been alive. It's existed and it still exists. It's a very powerful empire. But what's happening right now is ever since this trade war started with China, that a decline of this empire has started. And the thing about it is it's also a decline in the Eastern Empire, which is a building empire. So what we have is we have a declining empire and an empire that's trying to build. And this is an empire with the BRICS nations. An Eastern empire that's trying to build. Look at it like an old lion who's the leader of the pack, leader of what they call a pride of lions. And then a young up-and-coming lion that still has good teeth and his mane is still nice and dark. See, with old lions, their mane gets all like white looking and it's obvious they're getting old. But still a very powerful lion indeed, this dual world empire that exists. And so there's a challenge going on here between emerging markets and this emerging empire of the East and the declining empire of the West. Well, the empire of the West is a sprawling empire. It's as big as the Roman Empire, bigger than the Roman Empire. And it's in decline now. And one of the biggest problems with this empire is corruption. And the monetary system is totally corrupted and it's run on a Ponzi scheme. And, you know, everything operates in the system off of money. And so, where I'm going with this is, I pointed out in my shows that we are going to have a world that's like somewhat like the world of the Eloys and the Morlocks, but different. And let me explain. There's going to be areas in the world where I call them the Badlands. Areas that are now inhabited, they have electrical grid, they have maybe even big cities and everything else. These areas are going to become wastelands. As this empire declines, what's going to happen is it's going to shrink back. It has to shrink back. This is because of energy. We can already see the big fights over energy and food. These are two things that are going to be fought over, because these things are going into a state of not enough. I mean, it's shortages of food, and it's going to continue. It's going to get a lot worse. The world is run on oil. This is an oil-based economy in this world. And what we have is, we have limited oil resources, and it's getting harder and harder to get oil. And oil is energy. And so, the politicians who are in charge, they invent any scheme that they can think of, but ultimately behind all these schemes of theirs is the fact that the world's running out or running short on oil. Now, I know I'm going to get people going to come on my show and they're going to say, oh, there's all kinds of oil out there. But there's a formula here. How much oil does it cost to get oil out of the ground and get it into a usable form? And there's a formula here. It's costing more and more oil to get the oil out. I mean, it used to be they would spend like 1 barrel of oil to get like 40 barrels of oil out of the ground. And later it was only 30 barrels for a barrel of oil. So they spend 1 barrel of oil or energy to get like 30 barrels out of the ground, and then 20, and then 10, and so on. That's the way direction it's moving. It's going to move until it gets to a 1-to-1. When it gets to 1-to-1, if it costs a barrel of oil to get that barrel of oil, because it's either too deep or in too remote of a place to get it, then what does the world do for energy at that point in time? Well, we're not there yet. We're not even near there yet. But the oil is in decline. And no, I know there's people out there who say that the oil basically grows underneath the soil. It's a renewable resource. No, it's a non-renewable resource. Oil does not renew itself. So the world is making this change to try to switch over to renewable energy sources. Things like solar, wind power, and so on. But that requires oil again to get there. It requires the Earth's resources to get there. You're not going to build a big giant windmill for free and transport it and erect it and maintain it for free without an energy cost associated with it. You're not going to create solar panels and transport them and put them in location and set them up and everything for free. Hailstorms come along that can smash solar panels. Windstorms can smash them. And then they all have to be replaced. There's a cost of, they use major amounts of silver to produce them. None of these are free energy sources. The closest thing we have now to a free energy source that's up and coming is nuclear fusion. We do have nuclear fission, and they're going to turn toward it at a certain point again. But nuclear fission is a dirty way to produce. It's a dirty nuclear power. And it's very dangerous, in my estimation. I do not like nuclear fission. Now, nuclear fusion is wonderful, but we're not there yet. So we're an empire in decline, and basically what I'm pointing out to you guys, we're an empire in decline, and energy and food. And energy is linked to food production. It's part of the reasons. And we have a monetary system that is totally corrupt, with corrupt politicians, corrupt bankers, corruption all the way through the system. Everybody's trying to get what they need to get. It's just like the senators back during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Now, they were out to get everything that they could get, everything that they could steal and rob from what they knew was a collapsing empire. And we got the same thing today in the political structure. They're only out for themselves, not out for the people. And this is part of the reason why this system is going to decay and fall and collapse, is that people are only going to take so much. When they start starving, they're going to come in mass, and this is going to help increase exponentially the decline and fall of this empire. So what's it going to look like, this decline and fall? Well, the empire is going to start to shrink back. Parts of the power grid are not going to be able to be maintained on a permanent basis, and people are going to start moving out. So if you get an area, a part of the power grid, it could be here in North America, it could be in Europe, where they can't maintain it over a large area, and basically they might have power on for 2 or 3 days and power off for a week or two. Power on for 2 or 3 days, power off for a week or two. People get fed up after a while, and they say, well, we can't rely upon this as a reliable power source. And say telecommunications goes out in that area too. And the crime rate increases then exponentially again. You notice I'm using that word exponential a lot, but it's true. Crime would just go through the roof. Well, people are going to start moving out and moving into areas where the grid is maintained, increasing the population in some areas and decreasing the population in others as this empire decays. After a while, these areas that do not receive adequate support from the system, it's just like a person's body. When a person has a disease like, say, really, really bad diabetes. You probably all know people who've lost limbs because circulation starts to fail in the circulatory system of the body. And their limbs can go what's called gangrenous or gangrene, and the surgeons have to amputate the limb in order to save the person's life. This is the way with this system. There's going to be large areas that basically can't be supported any longer because the system is too corrupt. It's gone too far. See, what happened is the central banks, the Federal Reserve being the largest, most powerful of the central banks, they put a system in place back around 1914 that required exponential growth. It was a growth model. As long as the world continued to grow, they could continue to expand credit to match that growth in the world. And of course, we know we do not live on an infinitely large planet. We live on a finite planet, meaning we have limitations to the size of this planet and to the scope of how far that industry and how far agriculture and how far everything can extend out. Well, all of this means that they can continue to support and grow the money supply, provided that the world is continuing to grow. Like businesses are continuing to grow, industry is continuing to grow, agriculture is continuing to grow, and it's reliant upon GDP growth in the world. Real GDP growth, not fake GDP growth, but real GDP growth. So then they can continue to expand the monetary supply to match that GDP growth. But what happened was in 2008, we reached the limit. We expanded out to the whole world. We cut down the rainforests. We did all this kind of stuff. Expanded out industry to the furthest sectors of the world. The mines were mining as much as they reached peak mining in the world, almost peak everything around 2008. And we started to contract on a real basis. The whole entire world started to contract a little bit. What happened was that contraction extended itself to the monetary supply. And the way this is structured from from 1914 until now, the way it's structured, you can't have a contraction. It doesn't fly. So what happened was the ones who are in charge of the monetary supply overrode the contraction in the real-time system by expanding the monetary, continuing to expand the monetary supply, but it wasn't real. It was a fake expansion of the monetary supply. And in order to get away with this, they had to start taking control over all the markets on Earth as well. So when 2008 come, we had a free market up until 2008. And then all of a sudden they started to control all the markets through different methods that they use. Like the plunge, you've all heard of the plunge protection team. You've all heard of the exchange stabilization fund, and etc., etc. These are methods and means to control the markets. The Fed even has a window where, I guess, where they can buy stocks or whatever. Well, you know, they extended this control to the entire world over the markets in order to maintain this system. They took control over the price of gold and silver to keep it low in order to maintain the strength in the fiat currencies. They took control over everything, and they started to pump money into the system like it was never seen before. They got us by for a good many years. Now, here it is, 2022, many years later. 2008's way in the rearview mirror now at this point. And they're still running the world with this, extending the monetary supply. And continuing with this exponential growth, but in the monetary supply. Now, all of a sudden, we got the Fed coming along saying, okay, we've seen our mistake. We know this is causing tremendous inflation. It's going to eventually cause a hyperinflation. We've got to do something about it. So here we are, knights to the rescue. We're going to stop expanding the monetary supply, and we're going to contract it. What a joke. This ain't going to fly for very much longer. Maybe a month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe 4 months, but it's not going to fly very much longer. So what's coming? A contraction. They're going to cause a contraction, something like 2008. I mean, it's just absolutely obvious that that's what has to happen. Well, the contractions already began in 2008. The contraction began of the real world. They're only going to increase that contraction of businesses, and we can see it on a huge scale. Go to any shopping mall in any city in the United States, and you see empty stores everywhere. You say, well, that was COVID did that. No, this is the contraction continuing. And it's going to continue. And the system is going to undergo more and more contraction, which is going to cause this separation between these areas that are going to die off. Something like when a person has diabetes and their limbs die. And these are going to be large areas. Maybe an area 300-400 miles from one side of it to the other. It's just going to break off of the system. It might have big cities in it that already exist. But they go bankrupt. People don't want to live there. They start moving out. And they become what's called ghost towns. The power grid goes down in that area. The people who live in that area might salvage the copper that they can out of the system, out of the power grid, and so it can't be turned back on again. And these areas become wastelands, rough areas. And this is what's coming. And so I've tried to take some time here to explain to you why this is going to happen and kind of what it's going to look like. We're going to have a technologically advanced society, because this is the way we're moving into higher tech, coexisting alongside areas that are like the Wild West. And eventually what will happen is they'll put fences up, not allowing people that live in these Wild West type areas into the better areas, into the areas, I shouldn't say better, because it's going to be ultimately controlled areas. They're not going to want the people to come into these control areas. They're going to say, one of the excuses they'll use, they'll say disease, which will have partial truth behind it. There'll be a lot of incurable diseases in these rough areas, these Wild West type areas. And so what they'll do is citizenry that lives in these, they're going to ultimately be controlled by the system in these areas that maintain grid support, maintain infrastructure, while these other areas continue to disintegrate. Now put fences up around their areas, and guard gates, and they won't let you in if you live in the wild zones. or what I'm referring to as the Badlands. And these areas are going to pop up all around the globe, and the world's population is going to decrease. We're on the verge of a massive population decrease in the world that's going to happen over a period of time. And it's going to be a direct result of the empire sinking. The Titanic is sinking, guys. And it's just a matter of time now, and we're going to start to really see the effects of it. The damage has already been done. This year, we did not produce enough food for the world. Probably, I'm just going to guess, I'm going to say that hundreds of millions of people are going to start going hungry pretty soon. Because it's just not enough food's been produced this year. And they're not producing enough electricity. In places in Europe, they're going to be sitting in the dark all winter. And with temperatures, it could be like minus 20 degrees centigrade. With winds blowing outside. And they used to be, in the old days, they all had wood stoves and stuff, and a big wood house full of wood to keep them going through the winter. But what have they got now? They've converted over, and this has come suddenly upon them in places like Germany. And see, this could lead to massive civil unrest. It could lead to potentially to overthrow of governments. And during all of this scramble for food and for energy, this is when you're going to see these areas go down, the parts of the grid and stuff, in the confusion. And they might never come back on. And the people in those regions will start moving to the regions that do have power. It's just going to be a total mess. And in this total mess of confusion, of frustration, of the system being in decline and in decay, people are going to turn on one another. Diseases are going to make comebacks. Diseases that we thought were gone and in the rearview mirror. Diseases like tuberculosis. And there's going to be a dying off of only the strong are going to survive through this period coming up in probably the next 10 years. It's going to be really rough. And so when's all this going to start? It's already started, guys. It's going to get exponentially worse when we have the big crash of the markets caused by the Fed drawing liquidity out of the system. Anyway, I wanted to try to bring you guys up to date on this just a little bit. Years ago, I predicted the explosion of homeless people that's already occurring in the United States right now. I predicted it years in advance when nobody else was talking about it. There's a lot of things I've predicted on my channels that have come true, but they take time to come true. And people listen to my show. My show goes into the background, like background noise. People don't look at my old episodes. Well, there probably will come a time in the future when somebody will review this episode and they'll say, hey, Glenn was right on. I live in the city here and we have the bad zone, or he called it the bad zone. God knows what they'll call it. But it'll be obvious it was exactly what I was talking about right now in this show. And if you can imagine what that technologically advanced world will look like, I mean, I'll just go into it for a couple minutes, you know. I mean, a kid will come home and he'll have a robotic limb on his arm, and his mother will say, where did you get that? Where'd your arm go? Oh, Mom, it's all the thing now. All the kids want them. Everybody wants them, and I saved up for 6 weeks to get this. And she's going to be like, you had your arm surgically removed so you could have a robotic arm? And she'll be all upset at him. But he'll say, look what it can do. And he'll do all these fancy things with it, you know, and be able to turn it on. He might have a projector in his finger. He'll be able to point it at the wall and project holograms. And he'll have different kinds of games he can play with it and everything. And it's stronger than his old arm and everything else. You know, people will be having circuitry put into their brains. Probably a chip, maybe, the size of a grain of sand will go in behind your eye, and you'll just be able to think to turn it on and turn it off. And you'll have the internet all right there. It'll come up in a vid screen right in front of your eyes, so all you'll see is internet. or it might be opaque, or it might be translucent, right in front of your eyes, and so you'll be able to go online without even accessing a computer. It'll be right hooked up to your brain. New technologies like you wouldn't believe is coming. But at the same time, there will be people probably living 10 miles away from you, just outside the city on the other side of the fence. And they won't have hardly anything that's related to technology. They'll still be cooking their food on a fire, collecting firewood to try to live. Primitive. Very primitive. Something like what you see in these Mad Max movies. This is the world we're headed toward. And very rapidly. Probably cities that are run on renewable energies. But it's going to take time to get there. Where computer technology, you can't do anything without the computer knowing that you did it. I mean, the kind of technology where, in the cities, I mean, okay, if you're in the city zone and you're in an area that's got the technology, you might be walking to work one morning and all of a sudden a robotic ambulance comes up next to you and stops and says, "Get in. Citizen number 457-658-743-952-/A, get in the ambulance now." And you're like, "Why? What's wrong? Nothing wrong with me." The door of the ambulance opens and the robot says, "Get in now." You get in, you lay down, the door goes shut behind you, and all of a sudden equipment starts hooking up. Robots start hooking equipment up to your arms and everything else, and they hook an IV up to you, and you say, "What are you doing this for?" And the machine says, "A heart murmur was detected while you were walking to work." You say, "I didn't know I had something like that." And they'll say, "Yeah, oh yes, you know," and they're taking you to the hospital. And you didn't even call them. You didn't even know there was anything wrong with you. But they detected it. 24-hour monitoring. Things like that. That's the world we're headed toward. But on the other side of the fence, 10 miles away, the guy's caught himself some sort of a lizard out in the desert. And he's cooking it on an open fire, and he ain't got no technology or whatever. He could drop dead and nobody would even know his carcass is there for 6 weeks. Turkey vultures would be eating him. And he wouldn't even know. Because he's out in the desert, and nobody cares, nobody knows. This is the kind of world we're moving toward. Where there's going to be the people on one side of the fence and the people on the other side of the fence, and they can't cross. And this might only take 30 years to get there. To this kind of a world. But we're also looking at a diminished population. Probably looking maybe 30 years from now at less than 2 billion people. And we got 8 billion now. And so these areas that are not inhabited anymore, there's a good reason why, because there's not enough people. And, you know, the highways to these regions and stuff will still be there, but grass will be growing up through the cracks in the pavement. And the roads will be practically inaccessible because trees will be growing up through the pavement. Where we once sprawled, our civilization sprawled into magnificence. It was roads built everywhere. All the old roads that used to be gravel, they came through in the 1970s and 1980s and paved them all. Now already those roads are starting to break apart and go back to gravel again. Because that expansion that we made through growth was on an exponential, and we reached the peak of that exponential in 2008. And now we're already, since 2008 till now, in decline and fall. The collapse is here. It's already started. It started in 2008. We're deep into it now, and it's going to be accelerating now. But on the other side of this collapse, after the world's population has diminished, after we have renewable technologies and renewable energy sources, after we've modified our civilization completely in ways that you cannot even comprehend, then we'll go through a renaissance again, where our technological advancements increase exponentially too as well. When AI starts to take over and organize humanity at a certain point. And that will happen. And things like transhumanism, things like cybernetic organisms, where you have humans that are not completely human. They're part cyborg, part human. Or organ replacement. Basically, humans will be half robots, half machine, half human. Maybe the only part might be the brain, you know, or maybe just a few organ parts or something, and the rest of it's all machine, a person, you know. And I mean, they're already doing things like this. They already have frames that people can put on their body that they can wear, called ectoskeletons, I think they call them, or something. They're like a, and it enables people that work in warehouses and stuff. They strap these things on. They're strapping a robot on top of themselves so that they can lift more weights. They can lift boxes all day long and their back doesn't get tired. They already have this. Advancement's already moving very quickly. Anyway, listen guys, thank you guys for listening to my show here on the Delta Report, and you guys have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.